Hi, welcome back to Research and Education. This is Dr. Henkel here for week 4 of our course. Let's go ahead and start with the word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for today, and thank you so much for allowing us to be able to learn and to be able to learn so that we can help others and just use our talents for you, Lord. I pray that you would guide us as we are going through this chapter this week, and that you would guide my students and give them wisdom and knowledge to be able to understand the material, apply the material, and effectively use the material as they gain this knowledge, Lord, so they can use it in their field of study, how you would see fit. And we thank you so much. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. I want to say thank y'all so much for praying for my sister, Brie. She's my younger sister. She's 38 and she's still in the hospital. It's day 10. And it's been a whirlwind. She got COVID. She was on the mends 2 weeks. She was about to get out of quarantine. And then all of a sudden her stats just dropped. She couldn't breathe. She went to the hospital and they admitted her. And then she just couldn't keep her oxygen levels up. So she was just suffocating, really. And so she developed pneumonia, COVID pneumonia, and she was moved to the ICU. We've been up there with her. They only let one visitor at a time, and it's been real hard for family because just trying to figure out how she's doing, what her doctor has said, and just communicating with them. It's been really hard. And then when you're the one that's in there, it takes a lot out of you because you just want to be able to fix them and you can't. And so emotionally and physically it's exhausting. But I'm thankful that we are able to go in there and see her and be with her, because I know last year you weren't allowed to. So she's out of ICU now. She's recovering. She's not quite ready to be discharged because her oxygen keeps dropping whenever she gets up to do things. So thank y'all so much for praying for her, and I am thankful for God for answering our prayers. My family and I, my husband and my children, went up to the hospital and we prayed for her, and it was almost immediately she started improving. So we call it a miracle, and we're just so thankful for a God that hears our prayers and that we can go to him because of Jesus. So thank y'all so much. So for chapter 4, research and education, here's what it looks like in Moodle, and it has the same materials at the top. And it's over research questions and the hypothesis. We're also going to be focusing on the purpose of the study. So right here's the video that you're listening to, and then here's our learning objectives, and these are outlined by Creswell, so they're put here for you to read and know exactly what it is that you're going to be doing this week. So here's the PowerPoint for you to read. Now, hopefully you've already read chapter 4 out of your textbook, so whenever we go and discuss the PowerPoint, you're aware, you're able to make those connections of, okay, that's what that means, and you're able to build on what you've learned so that you can be better equipped to use this information, because this is a heavy chapter. This is probably one of the, I wouldn't say harder, but just it has a lot of content for you to learn. So here's the objectives. Now, the first slide, these are the 4 terms used to convey the intent of a study. The first one is your purpose statement. Then you have your research questions. Then you have your research hypothesis and your research objectives. Now, they differ in their intent in the study, okay? So for hypotheses, you're only going to have that in your quantitative studies. Your qualitative studies do not have hypotheses. So that's the main difference that I want y'all to grasp about this, is your hypothesis is only going to be given when you have a quantitative study. So Let's go to the next page here in my notes. Okay, so you need a purpose statement for your study. This advances the overall direction or focus for your study. It's going to have one or more sentences. It's in your quantitative studies as well as your qualitative studies. It's usually written as part of a statement of the problem. So they'll say the statement, and then they'll tell you the problem. Okay, so that's kind of how it's given. It's written in the study. Typically, it's the last sentence in the introduction, and it's in the part of the statement of the problem. So it's usually written as the purpose of this study is, and then fill in the blank. So you'll see that a lot. The purpose of the study is. And so here's an example. The purpose of the study is to examine the relationship between the use of internet communication between teachers and parents in a Midwestern school district and student achievement on test in high school social studies. Okay, so your next component are your research questions. So every research study has research questions. They narrow the purpose statement to specific questions to answer. So you have the purpose of the study is da 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 da, and then to narrow that down, you're going to list questions that you want your study to answer. So it gets you very specific on what it is that you're doing, okay? So you have to get focused. So you develop these before you identify the method of your study. So like the types of data that you're going to be analyzing and collecting and interpreting in your study. So you develop and write these prior to that part of your study. There's going to be multiple questions. So you're not going to just have one question. You're usually going to have multiple. They're in both your quantitative and your qualitative studies. So here's an example of some questions that you could have. Do parent-teacher internet communications affect student performance in the classroom? See how it's getting more focused. And then another question is, what types of internet experiences do parents have with teachers about the performance of the parents' children? So those are two good questions that you could ask. Next, now we're going to talk about our hypotheses. Remember, your hypotheses is only in your quantitative study. It's not in your qualitative studies. So this is when the researcher makes predictions of an outcome about a relationship among attributes or characteristics within the study. So it's not simply an educated guess. You hear that, a hypothesis is an educated guess, not for research studies. It's going to be based on your literature review that you've done. So what has been out there? What have you learned? What have you studied? What have other researchers done? And then you're going to make your hypothesis based on those relationships that you have found in other studies, okay? And you make a prediction. So you're not just guessing. It has to have some type of formulated this thought based upon facts that you have read and learned about, okay? You're going to base your results on past research, past literature, okay? You can predict future results when you repeat the study with new participants or new studies. So here's an example. Students in high schools in the school district in which parents and teachers communicate through the internet will have higher grades than students whose parents and teachers do not communicate through the internet. So that's your hypothesis. So you have your purpose statement, like what's the purpose of your study. Then you go and you give me some questions that you want to answer. And then based on that, what are you predicting is going to happen? And remember, you're only going to do this in quantitative studies, not your qualitatives, okay? We're not going to make conjectures like that with your qualitative studies. Okay, next slide is your research objectives. Now, these are not going to focus, we're not going to focus on these. They usually have a limitation in your research study. For example, the intent is stated in quantitative that specifies goals and what they plan to achieve, okay? They create minor and major goals. The end of a statement of the problem is usually where this is located, if it's in it, and it's after the lit review or it's on its own in the study. So we're not really going to focus on these, but just know that they do exist. They're usually written like this. The objectives in this study are. So we're not, like I said, we're not going to focus on that. We're going to be leaning more towards your hypotheses if you're doing a quantitative proposal. So an example would be to describe the frequency of internet communication between parents and teachers regarding the parents' children in high school social studies classes. So that would be like an objective. Just like you write your objectives whenever you're doing your lesson plans, you're teaching a class, or your teachers are, required to if you're in administration. It's the same concept. Okay, so moving forward. So why are these statements and questions important? Why do we do this? Well, they kind of guide your study. They help the reader along. They help you to develop the methods that you need to do. They also help you link the intent with the results. So the purpose statements and research questions guide you in your research as well as the reader. It helps the reader as well. So how do you design quantitative purpose statements, research questions, and hypotheses? Okay, so your purpose statement and research questions, we're going to be looking at just quantitative studies for a moment. Okay, we will answer these in 3 questions. So you're going to think, what is a variable? What is a theory? What elements go into these statements and questions? So this is kind of like a big meaty part of the chapter where it can get kind of confusing for you, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed with all the different types of variables they're going to discuss, the different types of theories. Just know that when you are writing your purpose statements, your research questions, and your hypotheses, you need to be cognizant of the variables that are at play. What theories are out there that could support your study? Because you will write about that in your study. You're not going to have to write about all of them. It's only going to be specific to your study. So don't get overwhelmed with the amount of information there is on this topic, on these topics. Just know that you're going to have to be cognizant of it, and you're going to have to identify what type of variables, what is the variable, what's your independent variable, what's your dependent variable, and we'll go into it. So let me flip. So first thing you need to do is to understand what are variables, okay? So variables can be measured and they vary among individuals. So variables can be measured. So you're not going to just like throw something out there that can't be measurable, because the purpose of the study is you want to find relationships that are measurable so that you can quantify it, so you can put it into your results section of your study, okay? So variables can be measured, okay? So they can be assessed on an instrument or observed and recorded on an instrument. So they also vary. So you can assume different values or different scores for different individuals. So naturally, like test scores, they're going to be different for different individuals, okay? We know what a variable is. Now, next, to design your problem statement, your research questions, and your hypothesis, first you're going to specify your variables. So we're going to go over a few slides that talks about specifying variables, okay? So you have to be able to measure and observe. So your variables are measurable and observable. They vary among individuals and organizations, okay, like test scores. They are key ideas researchers seek to collect info to address the purpose of your study. So this is like it guides your study. You're going to collect info on these variables so that you can fulfill the purpose of your study, okay? So here are some examples of variables. Here are some, but they're kind of very difficult to measure, like socialization skills, your imagination. That's not as concrete, okay? We're talking more abstract here. And then these variables are very difficult. You're not going to be able to measure them as well, okay? So your next slide. So we're still talking about specifying variables. So to distinguish between them, you record information from individuals in two ways. First, you answer questions on a questionnaire. Okay, so that's one way, like say gender, male, female. Okay. Second, to record information, you also need to observe the individuals and record their scores. So those are two ways that you can do it. You can get it on a questionnaire, or you're going to observe and do it. So it's either written down or you're going to observe it. Now you assign a score. So like say female is 1, male is 2. So you're going to assign the answer a score, because that's how you're going to be able to measure and give data. Okay. That's how you measure your variable. Now, researcher groups the scores into categories, or they use them to represent a value on a continuum. Okay, so let me see. These are types of variables in quantitative research. So we're still talking about just quantitative studies. So here's types of ways that you can measure them. A categorical measure is a value of a variable assigned by the researcher into a small number of categories, gender, okay? Or continuous measure would be like you're going from low to high. You're doing like scores on an exam. An example they give you here is like an age, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's a continuum. That's on a continuum. So it's a continuous measure. Now, categorical, you put them in a category. So these are just different ways that you score your variables, okay? It just depends what it is that you're studying. Is it going to be a categorical, or is it going to be more in a continuous? You can figure that one out. Okay, so now distinguishing variables from constructs. So there's a thing called variables, and then there's a thing called constructs. So let's learn what a construct is. We know that variables is like an attribute or characteristic stated in a specific or an implied way. A construct is an attribute or characteristic expressed in an abstract, general way. So variables are very specific. Constructs are not. So it's kind of like the opposite. So here's an example to think about. A construct, which is your abstract, would be student achievement. Okay? How much do they achieve? Variables would be your grade point average. So that's more specific. Okay? We'll go into more examples of these. Your book gives you a lot of examples. So if you're still kind of confused on what a construct is, go and look in your book and read that section again, and it will give you more examples. Whenever you're thinking variables, I want you to think of like a cause and effect relationship. So when we have something called your dependent variables and your independent variables. Dependents it's an attribute dependent or influenced by your independent variable. And then independents it's flipped. It's an attribute dependent or influenced by your dependent variable. Okay? So, dependent variables are outcomes, and you ask yourself, what am I trying to explain? Okay? That would be your dependent variables. Okay, and your independent variables are factors that influence the outcomes. So you're asking yourself those questions when you're trying to determine if it's an independent or dependent. And they feed off of each other, okay? Now, you're going to want to make sure that you have a control. This is very simple from science. You have your control groups whenever you're doing an experiment so that you make sure that nothing is going to interfere with the results. So you try to allot for those and control those and identify that. So what variables do I need to also measure? The control. So that I can make sure my major factors, your independent variables, influence outcomes, your dependent variable, and not other factors. The control variables and the mediating variables. And we'll go into that into more detail. So, I skipped a page, didn't I? 1 second. Okay, so there's something called confounding variables. Those are variables that you can't control. And so your control variable, it's important to consider and neutralize because it can influence your dependent variable. So you want to identify what you can control, what's your control variable, so that way it neutralizes the influence it could have on your dependent variable. And remember, your confounding variables are variables that you can't control. So now look at this arrow. It shows how the independent variable influences your dependent variable. So here's your independent variables. And here it is. Remember, thinking cause and effect relationship, okay? If this happens, then that's going to happen. Cause and effect, okay? Independent variables. Now, the arrow shows how the independent variable influences the dependent variables through your mediating variables. Your dependent variables, your book says, those are your most important variables, okay? Remember, your confounding variables are variables that you cannot control. Independent variables are your second most important variable, okay? And then your mediating variables, sometimes they exist, sometimes they do not. So they could be there, they could not be there. Now remember, cause and effect, dependent variables are the most important, with independent variables being the second most important. Confounding variables you cannot control. Researchers study your independent variables to see the effect they have on your outcome, your dependent variable, okay, your outcome, cause and effect. So we study these to see the outcome of this, okay? So that's like our results. So that's why the dependent variables are the most important, because that's the whole purpose of your study, is to get to that information, okay? Moving forward. So let's talk about our most important, the dependent variables. Now, it's an attribute or characteristic influenced by your independent variable. We just stated that. Now, these are examples of what your dependent variables could be. It's your outcome. Okay, so it's like also known as your outcome, the effect, the criterion, and the consequence. So if you see these words, those should be flags. Oh, that's talking about your dependent variable. This is very important. It's very helpful. Okay, so as you're reading studies, you can identify what those DVs are, dependent variables. I say DV a lot. Okay, so for your IV, independent variables. They are an attribute or characteristics that influence, that affects an outcome on or your dependent variable, okay? Those are also known as your treatment variable, measured variable. So what are you measuring? That's your cause. Control variable, your moderating variable, okay? So those are different types of independent variables that exist. Additional forms of your independent variable could be your control variable. Those are measured, important to consider to neutralize. Okay, we talked about that because they can impact your dependent variable. You don't want it to influence your dependent variable because then you're not going to get true results. Another example is your treatment variables. They're manipulated by the researcher. Then you also have moderating variables. They interact with another independent variable to influence the dependent variable. So they kind of have that relationship there where they will influence it, okay? So here's a nifty little table, and it just goes and it shows you more information about those type of variables. So I'll let you read that on your own. Now, we have the mediating variables. Remember, that one can influence it. So it's an attribute or characteristic that stands between the dependent and independent variable. Excuse me. So those may or may not be in your study, okay? And so it influences your dependent variable apart from your independent variable, okay? So it's not part of your independent variable affecting the dependent variable. It's on its own. And so they're not always in studies, but they're out there. So your book is just teaching you about those so that you could recognize that. Okay, so here's a little flowchart, and it says mediating variables. They, right here at the top, they stand between your independent variable and your dependent variable. They transmit the effects of the IV on the DV. So they play a part in the relationship from the independent variable to the dependent variable. Now, they're not always there. So an example would be, well, let's start here. Independent variable. Convenient office hours for students. The mediating variable, student becomes willing to take rest. Dependent variable, student seeks help from faculty. Okay, so since there were more office hours for students, they're willing to take more risk, and thus they're able to seek and get help from the faculty. Okay, so this is just talking about the unmeasured influence on the family of variables. They're called confounding variables or spurious variables. You can't directly measure these. The effects cannot be easily separated from the other variables, and they may influence the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. So basically, they just explain the limitations of your results, okay? Now, we have several reasons that drive our quantitative analysis to align with our purpose. So you want your analysis to align with your purpose whenever you're doing your study. So there's 4 steps to do that. The first step is describing your variables by reporting the mean and the variability. The second step, you may test the relationship between variables and make a comparison between 2 groups. Third step, probable cause establishes likely cause and effect between the variables rather than just proving the relationship. So you're likely looking for that cause and effect relationship, okay? Your last step is when theories predict relationships to test between the independent variable and the dependent variable, okay? So I know this is a lot. It will make more sense once you start actually doing your research, okay? Theories. So they explain and predict the probable relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. You might think about the test of a theory as the top of a list of reasons for studying the relationship among your variables. Now notice the increasing number of tests of studies it goes from a personal hunch, and then it goes all the way up through the chart to a sophisticated theory. So you might have a hunch, and then you do more tests, and then you can develop your theory, okay? And that's based upon the relationship between your IV and your DVs. So this is how theories come to play whenever you are doing your research. The quantitative purpose statement. So now we're going to talk about purpose statements. They identify the variables. So that's why we had to learn about variables, because in order to write your purpose statement for your research study, you're going to have to identify what your variables are in your study. You're going to have to discuss the relationship, those, and the participants in your study, and the site for your research. Where is it being conducted? You're going to use a single sentence to do this, and you're going to use words such as the purpose of this study, da, 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 da. Okay? So if you're going to use a theory, you're not required to, but you need to state the theory that you plan to test. So that's why we discussed theories. And theories, remember, they show the relationship between your IV and your DV. So if you plan on testing a theory with your study, that's when you state it now. And you use quantitative words like relate, relationships, compare, describe. Okay, so basically when you're doing a quantitative study, you're looking at your variables and the relationship that they have with each other. So you're going to want to use those type of terminology whenever you're writing your purpose statement. Your independent variables are listed first. Okay, then you're going to state your dependent variable. Then you're going to state your control or your mediating variables. Okay, if there are any mediating variables. Remember, there's not always mediating variables. And you're going to tell us your research site and then the participants. So all of these are within your purpose statement. Okay. And we get to go over some examples. So for instance, for this one, the purpose of the study is to test the theory, what theory it is, by relating, that's where you would plug in your independent variable, to plug it in, dependent variable, for plug it in your participants, and then plug it in for your research site. So all they're doing is just showing you exactly the order that you need to be writing your purpose statement. And so when you do yours, that's the order that I'm going to be looking for, okay? And I like it. It's scripted. It tells you exactly how you're supposed to write it, and you'll get the hang of it. And so by comparing your independent variable with group 1 and group 2 in terms of your dependent variable for participants at the research site, okay? So either way, I purposely, for starting out, I would follow the first example. Now, okay, so when you're writing your research questions now, so now we've done our purpose statement. That's just a sentence. Now you're going to write your research questions. You're going to describe results of your variables, compare 2 or more groups on the independent variable, okay, in terms of the dependent variable, and you're going to relate 2 or more variables. So make sure you're including those variables within your research questions, okay? That's how you get a little bit more specific, remember? So here's guidelines. You're posing a question. Begin with how, what, or why. You specify your independent, dependent, mediating, or control variables. So remember, you don't always have those, okay? Use the words describe, compare, relate to indicate the action or connection among your variables. So those are the words that I'll be looking for whenever you're writing your research questions. Indicate the participants and the research site for your study within your question, okay? So let's start that. Okay. Whenever you're doing your descriptive questions, I want you to identify the response to a single variable or question. So how frequently do your participants in the variable at the research site. How frequently do African Americans feel isolated on college campuses? Okay, so your African Americans are your participants. Your variable is feel isolated, and then your research site is at college campus. Okay, do you see how they put that in there? So here's another example. How do feelings of isolation, okay, so that would be your independent variable, to or influence the ethnic identity of African Americans, so that's your dependent variable and participants, in the United States. So that's your research location, okay? Now, let's keep going. So now we have comparison type questions. So these are just different types of question types, so you can get an idea of how you can word yours. The first one was you're looking at relationships, and now these are examples of when you're comparing something. So it says, how do African Americans and European Americans compare in their perceptions of ethnic identity? So they're comparing the Africans with the Europeans and comparing them. Okay, so those were your participants and then where they're at. Okay. The location's not there though. So it just has your participants, group 1, group 2, and it's the perceptions of ethnic identity would be your variable, the perceptions. So now they have writing quantitative hypotheses. Now remember, this is not just an educated guess. It's got to narrow your purpose statement. It advances your predictions, okay? So you're putting that out there. So here's an example. The more students feel alienated, the more likely they are to carry weapons to school. So that is a hypothesis that they are going to try to test within their study to determine if that is something that actually rings true. So here's some guidelines whenever you're writing your hypotheses. You're going to state the variables in the order. You're going to first do your independence, then your dependence, then your control. Okay, you're going to compare the groups. So if variables are related, specify the relationship between the variables. Make a prediction about changes you expect in your groups. Okay, so you're not just guessing. You're going to, based on the literature and other research studies, you're going to make that prediction. And you're going to state information about the participants at the site, unless it repeats information stated in your purpose statement. Okay. Now here's a chart, and this is talking about your null hypotheses and your alternative hypotheses. And one of your assignments, you're going to have to write these out. So the type of hypothesis, okay, the purpose. The purpose of your null is to test in general the population that there is no change nor relationship or no difference. So you're just trying to say there's not going to be any change in any regards, any way. Okay, an alternative hypothesis would be one that may be true if the null is rejected, if it suggests a change, a relationship, or a difference. So, like, if this is rejected, then this would be an hypothesis that you would think that would happen as a result of that, okay? It's pretty neat to do. So, specific language found in your hypothesis. There's no difference or relationship between. With this alternative hypothesis, the magnitude statements such as higher, lower, more positive, or more favorable. So those are the type of words that you would find within an alternative hypothesis. You're going to test both of these, okay? You would have to test these within your study if you're going to make those. So your null hypothesis, there's no change in the DV. Here's an example. There will be no significant difference in test scores between 5th grade boys and girls on the XYZ achievement test. So that would be an example of your null hypothesis. There's going to be no change. Here's an example of an alternative hypothesis. Okay, so an example would be Fifth grade girls will have higher scores on the achievement test than fifth grade boys. So if there's the first thing doesn't happen, then this was going to happen. So this is your alternative. Okay, so it specifies the direction of change, higher. It says it's going to have higher scores, and it's going to predict what will happen. Okay, so girls will have higher scores than your boys. Okay, I think it's pretty straightforward for these. We'll move forward. Okay, so how do you design qualitative purpose statements and research questions? So now we're moving away from our quantitative studies. So this would be for a qualitative study. You're going to understand how these statements and questions differ from quantitative research. Understand the role of a central phenomenon in qualitative research, and understand qualitative research as an emerging process. So here's the differences. Your quantitative, whenever you're talking about purpose statements, you're going to think probable cause and effect. Why did it happen? Whereas in qualitative studies, they're more open-ended. What happened? Okay. Quantitative, they use theories. Why did it happen in a view of an explanation or theory? So what theory is out there that could line up with your testing? Now, for qualitative, what was the meaning to people of what happened? So you're not going to be testing a theory. You're interpreting what they think, okay? Now, quantitative, remember, it's more close. So it says assess differences in magnitude. How much happened? How many times did it happen? What were the differences among the groups and what happened? Whereas qualitative, remember, they're more open-ended. So it's going to be like, what happened over time? So you're not specifying. You're just trying to identify what happened, okay? You're more focused on the process of how it happened, not what happened, okay? So that's why there's a time that a study needs to be quantitative because you need more specific, concrete data. And then there's a time when you would want to go and do a qualitative study because you're more focused on the process of how they got to that data. Does that make sense? So that's the difference. And that's also, it gives reason to why quantitative is needed for certain situations. And then there's the same thing with qualitative. That's needed in different situations. So as a researcher, you need to be able to decide which one would best suit this type of study. So the central phenomenon in qualitative research is a concept or process explored within this research. So you're going to focus on a single concept or process. So for example, the ethnic identity of Chinese American immigrants, or the process of negotiation by a female superintendent with her principals. So they're focusing on the process there, okay? So with quantitative studies, you're going to explain or predict the variables. Remember, cause and effect. X goes to Y. Qualitative, you're going to be looking for that central phenomenon. So you have this, it relates to that. And then you go forth with all these bubbles. They all kind of go around this central phenomenon, okay? So quantitative, you're going to have your independent variables influence your dependent variable, cause and effect. And we'll just think about cause and effect with quantitative. But with qualitative, you're going to do an in-depth understanding of why. So external forces shape and are shaped by why. That would be your right here, this why, the central phenomenon. Okay, so that's kind of just a visual of what and how these are different. Okay, I like that visual. I think that was pretty good. Now, how do you design qualitative purpose statements and research questions? Emerging processes in qualitative research. Qualitative research is an emerging design. Purpose statements and research questions may change. Feedback and responses of participants inform changes. So here's an example of that. I'll let y'all go through that. Now, when you're writing your purpose statement in qualitative research, you're going to indicate the intent that you want to explore. to understand that central phenomenon with specific individuals at a certain research site. So you're still going to tell us who the participants are and where they're at. And it's going to be located at the end of the introduction. So an example would be, the purpose of this qualitative study is to describe classroom learning using the internet for 5 high school students participating in a sign language class. Okay. See how it's going more, it's more about the process, okay? So they're going to describe the learning, of how these students participated in this class, okay? So that's the phenomenon. So when you're writing your research questions, there's guidelines for qualitative research questions as well. They're going to be more open-ended. They're going to be general questions that you could answer. So here's some guidelines to follow. Change and emerge based on participants' view and your understanding, so they can change. There's only a few general questions, and you're going to try to stay neutral with exploratory language. You're not going to just try to make a prediction on what's going to happen. So the central question is the overarching question you want to explore within your study. So qualitative research questions, they'll have a central question. So that's like your overarching, your umbrella question, if you want to think of it that way. So you're going to begin with how or what. Those are the words that they like to use. And you're going to specify the central phenomenon you want to explore, identify your participants still, and mention your research site, okay? Just like you did in your quantitative studies questions. So for example, what is creativity? So here it says what. What is creativity for 5 students, those are your participants, at Roosevelt High School? That's your location. So creativity. What is creativity? So you're kind of understanding what that is. You're not defining what it is. You're going to let the researchers or the participants define that for you, and then you are going to report it, okay? See how it's more open-ended? Okay, so here's a chart. Problems. So typically found in your central question in your qualitative study. Sometimes your problem question can be too general. What's going on here? Okay, that's a poor question. Instead, you can say, what is the process being used by the General Education Committee at the Liberal Arts School? They have their participants, they have their location, and their central phenomenon within that question. Sometimes they're too focused. For example, how did the committee make a curriculum decision about a course on the environment? See how it's too focused? So instead you could say, what is the process of the curriculum? Okay, so they want to focus on the process. Or you could have too many assumptions within your central phenomenon question. How did the curriculum committee address its alienated from the college administration? Okay, so that's assuming that they alienated. Okay, so now look, they've taken that word out and they rewrote it as, what was the role of the college administration in the curriculum committee's deliberations? So there you're going to identify what it is. You're not already assuming what it was. Okay, so then after you have your central umbrella statement, then you can have sub-questions for your qualitative research questions. Now, these divide the central question into smaller specific questions. So they narrow the focus and specific issues that can come up. So let's go. So, for example, your intent to subdivide the central questions into detailed questions. For example, what does it mean to be a professional teacher? Okay, so that's your central question. And then you're going to say, what do professional teachers do? What is difficult or easy about being a professional educator? See how it's giving you some other sub-questions that still focus on this central question. Okay, so procedural sub-questions, they subdivide the central question into steps. So it's procedures for collecting the data in your study. So for instance, here's your central question. Example, what is the change process in the revision of a general education curriculum on a college campus? And then you can have procedural questions to add to that. How did the process unfold? Who were the people involved? What events occurred? And so that's just going to be based upon what type of study you're doing. Do you need to ask them as issues, or are you going to be focusing on some type of procedure? And so then just depending on what it is that you're doing, that's the type of format that you would follow. Okay. So we're almost done. I know your brain's probably saturated with all of this. It is a lot. So we have 3 more slides. It says writing qualitative research questions. Distinguish qualitative questions from data collection questions. You're going to interview questions that are based on issues or sub-questions. Also ask other questions like an opening about the participants. And you might close with questions about others to interview. Okay. So re-examining the parent involvement and mother's trust and principles studies. Quantitative parent involvement study has a purpose statement and guiding research questions. To examine how the 4 psychological constructs influence parent involvement decisions across the 3 secondary grade levels, we pose the following research question. What are the relative contributions of parents' role construction, self-efficacy, perceptions of teachers' invitations, and perceptions of adolescents' invitations to predict parent involvement at home and at school in grades 7, 8, and 9? So there's a good example, okay, from that study. Now here's qualitative, okay? You're going to think this one has the principal study as the purpose statement and research questions. So it says, what are the perspectives of mothers of children with disabilities on trust in school principals? So that's more open-ended. So they're going to be discovering that within their study. They're not going to make an assumption of what it is, okay? So then it also says here for the research question, it says, or the purpose statement, we employed a qualitative research methodology to gain insight into the nature of trust of mothers and children with disabilities in school principals. So that's an example of your qualitative studies, okay, and what they've used for their purpose statement and their research question. So I really like how your book gives you plenty of, examples that you can go back and see, okay, what is that qualitative research question supposed to look like? So use that within your book as good examples, as well as the articles that you've been doing on teacher stress. You'll be able to see them in there as well. If you have any questions about this, just remember I'm here to help you. I know this was a lot of information, but just think of it as you're just getting kind of a big picture of the different components so that you're able to go in and write your research questions, your purpose statement, and hypothesis, if that's also something that you're going to do with your quantitative studies. Okay, guys, well, thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.